So the year is 1545, and we are high up in the Andes Mountains in what we now call Bolivia.
Right.
And when I say high, you really need to picture an altitude of like 13,000 feet above sea level.
Which is just punishing.
Yeah, you're well above the tree line. The air is so incredibly thin that your lungs just burn standing still. The wind is freezing, water boils at a completely lower temperature, and the landscape is essentially just this barren, hostile rock.
Not exactly prime real estate.
No, exactly. So up in this freezing desolation, there's this indigenous Quechua man named Diego Golpa, and he is just having a terrible day.
A really bad day.
He's chasing a stray llama up the slopes of a mountain. The sun goes down, the temperature just plummets, and Diego realizes he is completely stuck on this peak overnight.
Which is a death sentence if you aren't careful.
Right. So to keep from freezing to death, he gathers whatever little scrub and brush he can find, and he lights a small campfire. He huddles next to it, manages to survive the night, and then the next morning, as the sun comes up, he looks down at the ground right beneath the dying embers of his fire.
And this is the crazy part.
Yeah, the heat from his little survival campfire has literally melted the earth. Beneath the ash, the ground is just streaked with rivers of pure, shining silver.
I mean, it is essentially the inciting incident of the modern global economy. Diego Golpa didn't just find, a silver nugget.
Right.
He found a mountain where the surface rock was so insanely rich with ore that a simple wood fire could literally smelt it right in the open air. He found Cerro Rico, the rich mountain.
And that is exactly what you and I are exploring today. We've pulled together this massive stack of sources for you. We've got historical archives from the Spanish Empire, metallurgical scientific analyses of 16th century coins.
The science stuff is wild, by the way.
Oh, it really is. Plus, we're looking at global trade reports that map out the very first transoceanic shipping routes, along with some really cool deep dive historical transcripts and expert AMAs.
So we have a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, our mission for this deep dive is to take you on a journey through what was the absolute lifeblood of the first truly global economy. We are looking at how a single metal silver succeeded, where gold totally failed.
Exactly. Our goal isn't just to, recite dates at you.
No, definitely not.
We want to understand why silver built empires and how it completely destroyed them through economic forces that, honestly, nobody at the time even understood.
They were clueless.
Totally clueless. And we're going to get into the harrowing, unbelievable human cost that paid for it all and some really strange, exciting tales of the people who lived through this massive wealth transfer.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's stay right there on that mountain with Diego Golpa. Because while Diego's campfire discovery sounds like a fairy tale, the local indigenous people actually already knew there was something terrifyingly powerful about this specific mountain.
They did, yeah. There is this deeply ingrained Inca legend attached to this peak.
I love this story.
It's fascinating. Decades before Diego Golpa was even born, the 11th Sapa Inca, Emperor Huayna Capac, was touring his domain. And he looked at this massive, conical peak dominating the landscape and sensed its potential.
As you do when you're an emperor.
Right. So he ordered his vassals, his miners, to go up there and just tear into the earth to extract whatever wealth was hidden inside.
But they never brought any silver back to the emperor.
Right. No, they didn't. The oral tradition basically states that as soon as the Inca miners took their flint tools and struck the rock, preparing to open the veins, the mountain reacted.
Like physically reacted.
Yeah. A thunderous, deafening voice roared from deep inside the earth, completely shaking the ground. The voice commanded them to stop immediately, warning them, "Do not take the silver from this hill because it is destined for other masters."
Wow. Imagine being an indigenous miner, hearing the earth itself literally scream at you.
You'd run.
Oh, I'd drop my tools and run for my life. And when they got back to the emperor and had to explain why they failed, they used their native Quechua word to describe that terrifying, explosive roar, which was Potosi.
Which the Spanish, upon arriving decades later, corrupted into Potosi. They named the mountain Cerro Rico, and the boom town that violently erupted at its base became the imperial city of Potosi.
And to understand this story, you really have to wrap your head around the sheer, incomprehensible scale of Potosi. We aren't talking about a prosperous little mining camp here.
No, not at all.
In the second half of the 16th century, this single freezing mountain produced an estimated 60% of all the silver mined in the entire world.
Yeah, let's put some real numbers to that to make it tangible. Over the centuries of Spanish colonial rule, this one mountain yielded anywhere from 40,000 to over 100,000 tons of silver.
It's a staggering amount of metal.
It is, and the demographic explosion was unlike anything the world had ever seen. You have to remember, this is at 13,000 feet. It is an environment fundamentally hostile to human life.
You can't even farm there.
Exactly. Every single piece of food, every piece of timber, every tool has to be hauled manually up the Andes. Yet because the silver was just so abundant, a city of 160,000 people materialized basically out of thin air.
160,000 people in the late 1500s.
Yeah.
That made Potosi larger than London. It was larger than Paris, larger than Rome or Madrid, just sitting on top of the Andes.
It's hard to even picture.
I was actually trying to come up with a modern analogy for what this meant for the Spanish Empire. The best way I can conceptualize it is, imagine if tomorrow a relatively powerful country just stumbled upon a literal physical mountain made entirely of Bitcoin wallets,
Right.
all unlocked, just waiting to be scooped up. How does the 16th century society even begin to process a geyser of unearned, unimaginable wealth that they didn't invent but simply planted a flag on?
Well, the short answer is it completely shorts out the global financial hierarchy. The Spanish-American mines overnight became the world's absolute cheapest source of silver.
They just won the lottery.
Basically, Spain was suddenly handed a blank check. They could fund these massive standing armies, build the legendary Spanish Armada, and purchase unlimited luxury goods from Asia without having to produce any corresponding domestic exports.
Right. They didn't have to make anything. They were simply exporting the earth itself.
Exactly.
But hold on. Planting a flag on a mountain of silver is the easy part. Actually getting it out of the rock, refining it, and moving it across oceans. That is an entirely different beast. The logistics are terrifying.
Oh, they're a nightmare.
Let's break down the evolution of the extraction. Because Diego Gualpa's campfire trick only worked for a little while, right?
Right. So in the initial boom, like the 1540s and 50s, the Spanish relied entirely on indigenous technology. The surface ore of Cerro Rico was oxidized sergerite.
Okay, what does that mean chemically?
From a chemical standpoint, this stuff is incredibly rich and very easy to smelt. The local Quechua workers used small, wind-blown clay furnaces called guairas. They were shaped almost like flower pots with holes in the sides.
To let the wind in.
Yeah, to let the fierce Andean mountain winds fan the charcoal flames. It was super efficient for that specific type of surface rock.
I was reading accounts from Spanish observers standing in the city at night, looking up at Cerro Rico and seeing the flames of like 12,000 of these little clay furnaces glowing all over the slopes. It must have looked like a beautiful, terrifying volcano.
A glowing mountain of money.
Exactly. But the honeymoon phase ends quickly. By 1565, the easy surface ore is gone. The miners have dug down into the harder, deeper rock. They hit silver sulfide. And silver sulfide does not care about your little clay furnace.
It really doesn't. Silver sulfide is a complex compound where the silver is stubbornly bonded to sulfur and other minerals. You cannot just melt it out with a charcoal fire.
So the whole operation just halts.
Production at Potosi absolutely plummets. The Spanish crown, whose entire geopolitical strategy now completely relies on this silver, goes into a full-blown panic.
The blank check is bouncing.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is the technological pivot. In 1572, the Viceroy of Peru, a man named Francisco de Toledo, arrives in Potosi to fix the problem. And he introduces a process that was actually invented a few years earlier in Mexico by a merchant named Bartolomé de Medina.
The patio process.
The patio process. It is one of the most consequential industrial innovations in human history, and chemically, it is an absolute nightmare.
I was reading the breakdown of this in our sources, and if you tried to explain this to a friend at a pub, you'd sound like a mad scientist. Walk us through the actual chemistry and mechanics of how they got the silver out of this hard rock.
Okay, so first, they had to pulverize the rock. The Spanish built massive water-powered stamp mills, giant wooden and iron hammers, continuously smashing the ore until it became a fine, sandy powder.
Like industrial blenders.
Yeah. Then they would mix this powder with water to create a massive amount of toxic slime. They spread the slime out across huge, flat stone courtyards. These were the patios.
Right, so you have a courtyard full of wet rock mud. Then what?
Then they start adding the chemicals. First, ordinary salt sodium chloride. Then they add something called magistral, which is essentially roasted copper sulfate.
Wait, pause right there. What is the salt and copper sulfate actually doing? Because they aren't just throwing things in randomly.
You know, it's a very specific, complex chemical reaction. The salt and the copper sulfate react together in the wet mud to form copper chloride. This copper chloride then acts as a catalyst.
Okay.
It attacks the stubborn silver sulfide in the rock, breaking the bonds and converting it into silver chloride. Now the silver is finally vulnerable. And this is where the most crucial and honestly most dangerous ingredient comes in: liquid mercury.
The magic ingredient. They just pour massive amounts of liquid mercury into this chemical mud pie.
Yeah. Because mercury has an incredible property, it bonds almost magically with precious metals to form an amalgam. The mercury acts like a chemical sponge, soaking up the freed silver particles out of the sludge.
That's wild.
But to make this reaction happen, the mercury has to be thoroughly, intimately mixed into the mud. You can't just stir it with a stick.
And this is where the human horror really begins. Because to mix this toxic sludge of rock, salt, copper sulfate, and liquid mercury, the Spanish marched mules and very often human guns, indigenous laborers, barefoot into the courtyards.
Yeah.
They forced them to tramp through this freezing toxic sludge for weeks on end, just stomping it down to force the mercury to meet the silver.
It's horrific. You have barefoot humans absorbing heavy metals directly through their skin in freezing temperatures.
It's literally a death sentence.
It was. Once the amalgamation was finally complete, which sometimes took up to a month, they would wash away the mud, leaving behind a heavy silvery paste. That paste is the silver-mercury amalgam. They would take that paste, put it in a massive retort oven, and heat it.
Right, and since mercury has a lower boiling point than silver, the mercury vaporizes into a gas, leaving behind the pure solid silver.
Exactly.
But think about what happens to that vaporized mercury. It goes right into the air. It goes into the lungs of the workers operating the ovens. The environmental poisoning of the entire region was just catastrophic.
Unprecedented ecological damage.
But let's look at the supply chain of this nightmare. You need literal tons of mercury to process the millions of tons of silver ore. Where does a 16th century mining operation get massive amounts of mercury?
It's the ultimate logistical bottleneck. The
Yeah.
Spanish were incredibly lucky, or unlucky, depending on your perspective, to have discovered a massive mercury mine at Huancavelica.
Where's that?
It's located in modern-day Peru, several hundred miles northwest of Potosi.
So they have a mercury mine, but you still have to move a highly toxic, heavy liquid across the Andes.
Yes. The supply chain was absolutely terrifying. They packed the liquid mercury into specialized leather bags, loaded those bags onto the backs of thousands of mules and llamas, and marched them across hundreds of miles of the most treacherous, freezing mountain passes on Earth.
That's insane.
The entire global economy, the funding of the Spanish Empire, suddenly hinged on this incredibly fragile thread of mules carrying toxic liquid through the mountains just to keep the patio process running at Potosi.
Okay, so you've tortured the earth, you've poisoned the workers, you've evaporated the mercury, and you finally have your pure silver bars. Now you have to get it to Europe. If we trace the actual route of a single piece of silver, the sheer distance is staggering.
Oh, the logistics of the export were just as complex as the extraction. The silver is stamped, taxed, and then loaded onto massive mule trains. This heavily guarded caravan was known as the Situado.
And the Situado leaves Potosi, dropping thousands of feet in elevation, winding through hostile indigenous territory and brutal terrain until it finally reaches the Pacific coast at the port city of Arica.
Right. And at Arica, the silver is transferred to ships. But they don't sail for Spain yet.
No.
They sail north up the Pacific coast to Callao, which is the heavily fortified port city serving Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Here, the silver from Potosi is consolidated with silver from other, smaller mines.
Then the fleet sails further north, all the way up to Panama City, on the Pacific side of the Central American Isthmus. And here's where it gets really miserable.
The worst part of the journey.
Because the Panama Canal obviously won't exist for another 350 years. So they have to unload thousands of tons of silver off the ships, put it back onto mules, and hack their way through the dense, humid, malaria-infested jungles of Panama.
The Camino Real. It was a death trap of tropical diseases, oppressive heat, and ambushes. They had to drag this immense wealth across the isthmus to the Caribbean port of Portobello.
Once at Portobello, they wait for the arrival of the legendary Spanish treasure fleets, massive, heavily armed galleon convoys that operated on a strict annual schedule.
Like clockwork.
The fleet loads the silver, sails to Havana, Cuba, to rendezvous with the fleet coming from Mexico, and then together this massive armada rides the Gulf Stream across the Atlantic Ocean, dodging hurricanes and pirates, until it finally arrives at the Casa de Contratación in Seville, Spain.
It is a miracle of early modern logistics that any of it made it. But this raises an obvious question.
What?
If Potosi was generating 60% of the world's silver, And the route was this long and vulnerable. Why didn't the great rival empires like the English, the Dutch, the Portuguese just sail down to South America, march inland, and conquer the mountain?
Seriously, why bother being a pirate in the Caribbean trying to hijack a galleon when you could just take the source?
Because the Spanish institutional framework in the Americas was a fortress, both physically and bureaucratically. Potosi was located deep, deep inland, shielded by the brutal geography of the Andes.
You can't exactly march an army up there.
No, you couldn't march a European army up to 13,000 feet. They would die of altitude sickness and starvation before they fired a single shot. Furthermore, the Spanish had deeply entrenched administrative networks, viceroyalties, regional courts, local militias. The logistical cost of an invasion was mathematically impossible for rival powers.
So the rivals adapted. If you can't take the mountain, you adapt the plumbing. You create a shadow economy. And this brings us to the smuggler's paradise, Buenos Aires.
Exactly. Buenos Aires, located far to the south on the Rio de la Plata, was technically part of the Spanish Empire, but it was incredibly isolated from Lima.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants set up shop there. They realized that the Spanish mine owners and merchants in Potosi hated paying the exorbitant taxes to the Spanish crown.
So instead of sending all their silver on the official, heavily taxed Cituado route up to Lima and Panama, corrupt mine owners would secretly pack unregistered silver onto mules and send it south, down through the mountains to the flatlands, all the way to Buenos Aires.
A massive detour.
Yeah, and the Dutch and Portuguese merchants there would buy this untaxed silver, offering the Potosi mine owners much better returns than the official Spanish galleon system.
It was a massive, continent-spanning black market, a 16th century dark web for precious metals. The Spanish Empire was hemorrhaging wealth out the back door of its own continent, and local Spanish officials were routinely bribed to look the other way.
But whether the silver went out the front door on a galleon or the back door on a Dutch smuggling ship, every single ounce of it required human labor to pull from the earth. The staggering logistics we just mapped out, the stamp mills, the toxic mercury tramping, the mule trains, none of it functioned without an expendable labor force.
You really cannot separate them.
But Viceroy Toledo saw this cultural precedent and just weaponized it.
He turned it into a localized draft for a death camp. Under the Spanish Mita, 1 out of every 7 adult indigenous males from a vast surrounding area, encompassing hundreds of thousands of square miles from modern-day Ecuador down toward Argentina, was legally drafted to work the mines of Potosi for a period of 1 year.
That is horrifying. At any given time, there were over 13,000 of these conscripts working on the mountain. They were called mitayos. And the conditions they faced literally defy human comprehension. We aren't talking about modern mining with wide shafts, ventilation, and elevators.
Not at all. The Spanish didn't want to spend money on infrastructure. The miners followed the veins of silver wildly, creating narrow, twisting, erratic tunnels that went deep into the earth. The mitayos were sent underground for shifts that lasted 6 continuous days.
6 days underground.
They lived in the dark, breathing the dust.
Let's visualize this for a second. You are a metayo. You have just chipped away raw silver ore using an iron bar. You pack that ore into a heavy sack made of hide. The sack weighs 100 pounds. You strap it to your back. Now, you have to get out of the mine.
Which is the hardest part.
You aren't walking up a ramp. You are climbing up a shaft using ladders made of twisted rawhide cables and wooden rungs. You are climbing hundreds of feet in pitch black, lit only by a single candle tied to your forehead or your thumb.
Just picture that physical strain.
You are carrying 100 pounds on your back. The air is foul, filled with silica dust.
Yeah.
And you are doing this at 13,000 feet above sea level, where a healthy person walking on flat ground feels out of breath. If your grip slips, you fall into the darkness, taking the men below you down as well.
The mortality rate was horrific, and it wasn't just Bolivia. In Mexico, where the Spanish had massive silver strikes in places like Zacatecas and Guanajuato, the labor system evolved differently but was equally insidious. There, they relied heavily on debt peonage.
How does debt peonage differ from the mita?
In Mexico, the workers were technically free-wage laborers, but the catch was that the mines were isolated. The only place to buy food, clothing, and mining tools was the company's store, owned by the very mine owners employing them.
Oh, the classic company store trap.
Exactly. The owners charged astronomically inflated prices, so the workers' wages never covered their living expenses. They were forced to take loans from the owners, trapping them in a cycle of generational debt. They were legally bound to the mine until the debt was paid, which was mathematically impossible.
And when the indigenous populations began to physically collapse, when there simply weren't enough bodies to feed the mountain due to the work conditions and the diseases, the Spanish pivot to chattel slavery.
Yeah, they began importing enslaved Africans by the tens of thousands.
Because the altitude of Potosi was so deadly to those not acclimatized to it, the enslaved Africans were often placed in the smelting operations, working the massive bellows or tramping the toxic mercury mud. It was exhausting, lethal work that consumed human lives as fuel.
When we look at all the sources we've gathered, you see an intense juxtaposition in how this era is historically framed. On one hand, you have the purely macroeconomic view, the lens that focuses on the astonishing accumulation of capital, the birth of global infrastructure, and the monetization of international trade. To some right-leaning economic historians, Potosi was the ultimate engine that built the early modern global capitalist world.
Right, but then you have the reality on the ground of the labor lens.
Yeah.
Through this more left-leaning view, Potosi is colonialism at its most parasitic and barbaric. It is a mountain that eats men, and every single piece of Spanish silver that circulated the globe, funding Renaissance art and European expansion, had a literal, undeniable blood stain on it.
And we don't need to apply a modern political label to it to understand the gravity, because our job isn't to take a side here, but to report what the sources say. Both realities existed simultaneously and interdependently. The breathtaking cheapness of the silver, which made global trade possible, was entirely subsidized by the unpaid lives and stolen health of the indigenous and enslaved workers. The macroeconomy was built on a micro-tragedy.
And for the people actually trapped down in those narrow, twisting shafts, the psychological toll was so extreme that they had to invent a new theology just to survive it.
Down there, the domain belonged to a demonic deity of the underworld, a lord of the minerals whom they called El Tío.
The miners built terrifying statues of El Tío right into the walls of the mine shafts. They sculpted him out of clay and ore, giving him horns, a terrifying face, and an open mouth. And every time a miner went down into the dark, they would leave offerings for the devil.
They would place coca leaves in his mouth, pour pure alcohol at his feet, and light cigarettes for him.
It was pure extortion by a localized god. The belief was that if you kept El Tío happy, fed, and intoxicated, he would reveal the rich veins of silver to you and keep the roof of the mine from collapsing on your head.
A literal deal with the devil.
Exactly. But if you failed to leave an offering, if you angered him, El Tío would eat you. He would cause a cave-in or make you fall off a rawhide ladder. It is such a profound psychological survival mechanism. When you are forced into a living hell, the only way to process your reality is to actively worship the devil that runs it.
And cave-ins were just the acute threat. The chronic threats, the diseases of the trade, were a slow, agonizing death sentence. We already talked about the mercury tramping and the patio process. The workers absorbing mercury developed severe poisoning, which they grimly referred to as the shakes.
Mercury is a neurotoxin. It systematically destroys the central nervous system.
It causes severe tremors, personality changes, cognitive decline. It rots the gums so severely that workers' teeth would simply fall out of their heads. And for the men underground who escaped the mercury, they faced silicosis, or pneumoconiosis.
Drilling and smashing the rock in a confined space creates clouds of microscopic silica dust. With no ventilation, the miners breathed this in for 12 hours a day. The silica particles embed deep in the lung tissue.
It's basically breathing in microscopic glass.
Yes, and the lungs respond by forming scar tissue around the particles, eventually making the lungs completely rigid. The miners literally suffocated to death from the inside over a period of months. A Spanish observer at the time wrote a chilling summary of the Mita. If 20 healthy Indians enter on Monday, half may emerge crippled on Saturday.
The tragedy is compounded when you realize that the silver trade didn't just spread local diseases. This newly established, robust global supply chain became a high-speed superhighway for global plagues.
Pathogens absolutely love international trade. The same galleons moving tons of silver across the Atlantic were carrying rats infested with fleas and sailors carrying viruses.
The biological exchange.
The silver trade routes facilitated the rapid spread of smallpox to the Americas, which decimated the indigenous populations, the very people the Spanish needed to mine the silver. Later on, these maritime networks helped move outbreaks of the bubonic plague. The wealth of the world and the death of the world were traveling on the exact same ships.
So, if we step back and look at the sheer, staggering volume of wealth being pulled out of the ground and the immense human sacrifice required to get it, the most important economic question remains. Where did the money actually go? Who got rich?
Let's follow the money. I love this part because it breaks down the illusion of empire. Let's take a single 100-pound sack of raw Potosi silver ore and look at the profit premium. If we imagine that sack as a pie representing 100% of the generated wealth, how does that pie get sliced up?
At the very bottom, obviously, you have the workers. The Matayos, the peons, the enslaved laborers. They received less than 1% of the value they extracted from the earth.
Less than 1%.
And even that minuscule fraction wasn't in silver. It was mostly paid in subsistence rations, corn, dried potatoes, and coca leaves, which they chewed constantly just to numb the pain, suppress their appetite, and keep themselves working at altitude.
Okay, moving up the ladder. You have the colonial governors, the magistrates, the Spanish bureaucrats managing the city of Potosi. They skimmed about 2 to 5%.
Now, officially, this came in the form of administrative fees and salaries, but in reality, a massive chunk of this was pure corruption. Rampant bribery, cooking the books, and charging illicit fees to the mine owners in exchange for turning a blind eye to smuggled silver.
Next slice. The transporters and shippers. The mule drivers braving the Andes, the captains of the Spanish galleons navigating hurricane-infested waters. They took roughly 5 to 10% of the cut.
It was incredibly dangerous work, dealing with pirates, storms, and treacherous terrain, so the logistics premium was high.
Then you reach the Spanish crown. The King of Spain took a massive slice, about 20 to 25%.
Yep, the royal cut.
How did they enforce that across an ocean?
Primarily through the Quinton Real, or the Royal Fifth. This was a flat 20% tax on all silver produced. Every piece of silver legally extracted had to be brought to the Royal Mint in Potosi, weighed, and stamped with the royal seal. If you were caught with unstamped silver, you were ruined.
And they also control the chemicals, right?
Oh, yes. The crown made a killing through their absolute monopoly on the mercury from Huancavelica. They forced the miners to buy the toxic chemicals from the government at a huge markup and then taxed the silver those chemicals produced.
It's a brilliant, evil double dip. But wait, if the king is only taking 25%, who is getting the rest?
You have the merchants and financiers. They took another 20 to 25%. These were the men who never got their hands dirty. They lived in comfortable villas, providing the massive lines of credit, the timber required for the stamp mills, the iron for the tools, and the luxury goods imported from Europe. They financed the industrial complex and reaped massive, relatively risk-free rewards.
But the biggest slice of the pie, the ultimate winners of the Potosi boom, were the azogueros. They took 35 to 40% of the total wealth.
The azogueros were the mine owners and the mill operators. They were the local lords, the CEOs of the colonial era. While the king in Spain claimed the mountain, the azogueros controlled the physical reality of it.
They held all the cards.
They held the ultimate local power, commanded private militias, and accumulated wealth that is hard for us to even conceptualize today.
And when human beings accumulate that level of sudden, incomprehensible wealth, they lose their minds. The historical tales of the silver barons are pure excess.
Take the story of Georg Fugger. The Fugger family were a massive German banking dynasty, deeply embedded in the European side of the global metal and spice trades. The wealth flowing into their coffers from the global economy was staggering. The legend goes that Georg Fugger fell madly in love with a noblewoman in Trento, Italy.
But her parents were old-school aristocracy. They looked down on Georg. To them, he was just a merchant, new money. They told him that if he wanted to marry their daughter, he had to provide a grand and magnificent palazzo that proved his worth.
So Georg, flush with the infinite liquidity of the silver boom, supposedly invoked the devil himself to build a sprawling, impossibly opulent mansion in a single night just to humiliate the noblewoman's parents.
That is the ultimate flex.
They literally called it the Devil's Palace, the Palazzo delle Aldere. It's a perfect metaphor for how this tidal wave of new mining money violently disrupted the old land-based European aristocracy.
But the wealth was also a trap. Look at the local legends right there in Potosi. The story of Donna Clara perfectly encapsulates the boom and bust cycle of the mountain. During the golden age of Potosi, when the surface ore was practically pure silver, Donna Clara was the most famous, most sought-after courtesan in the city.
Her wealth rivaled that of the azogueros.
It was obscene. Her mansion was reportedly filled with solid silver furniture. She ate off solid silver plates, drank from gold chalices, and had a small army of servants catering to her every whim. She lived like a queen in the sky. But she lived too long. The easy surface silver ran out. The patio process required massive capital investment. The plagues hit the labor force. The economy of the city shifted. The men who showered her with silver went bankrupt or died. And by the time Donna Clara was 92 years old, the woman who once had solid silver chairs was found wandering the freezing, dusty streets of Potosi begging for scraps of food.
The mountain gave, and the mountain took away. But it is worth noting that the story of the barons doesn't end in the colonial era. The mountain wasn't finished. If we jump forward to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the silver veins finally started to completely exhaust themselves, a new generation of modern barons emerged.
Men like Simon de Petino and Louis Sue.
Yes, they realized that while the silver was gone, Cerro Rico was also packed with massive deposits of tin. And the industrializing world suddenly needed tin for canning food and manufacturing.
So they just rebooted the mountain.
Exactly. These modern barons brought in combustion engines, modern rail lines, and modernized smelters. They pivoted the entire Bolivian economy to tin mining, building massive global fortunes all over again from the exact same portrait mountain, utilizing labor conditions that, frankly, were still horrifyingly exploitative.
Okay, so we've established the scale, the horror, and the wealth of the silver trade. But I want to take a step back and ask a fundamental question about the nature of currency itself. We always think of gold as the ultimate prize. Kings hoard gold, pirates hunt for gold. Why was silver the metal that actually built the global economy rather than gold?
It comes down to utility and what economists call the bimetallic struggle. Gold is incredibly rare, which makes its value density extremely high. It is perfect for storing vast amounts of wealth in a small physical space.
Right.
But that high-value density makes it completely useless for everyday commerce.
Think of it mechanically. If you are a merchant in the 16th century trying to buy a loaf of bread, a chicken, or a pair of boots, you cannot hand the baker a gold coin. The value of a gold coin is so high that it would be like walking into a convenience store today and trying to buy a pack of gum with a $10,000 bill.
The baker doesn't have change for that.
No. You would literally need a jeweler's microscope and a scalpel to shave off the infinitesimally small amount of gold that equals a loaf of bread.
Exactly. Silver, however, had the perfect scarcity-to-weight ratio. It was rare enough to hold intrinsic value, but common enough that an ounce of it equated to the price of normal, everyday goods and labor.
My favorite analogy for this. Think of silver as the global checking account of the medieval and early modern world. It is the liquid cash you use to pay soldiers, buy timber, and trade for spices. Gold is the untouchable savings account. Gold is locked up in the deep vaults of state treasuries, only moved around in massive blocks to settle international debts between kings.
And because Potosi and the Mexican mines were churning out millions of tons of silver, the Spanish were able to mint enough of it to supply the entire world's checking account. They created the first truly global currency.
The peso de ocho, the piece of eight. We've all heard the pirate movies talk about pieces of eight, but this was a real foundational financial instrument, minted right there in the Americas, stamped with the Pillars of Hercules and the mark of the Spanish crown. And the reason it conquered the globe wasn't just volume, it was reliability.
Reliability is everything in currency. The piece of 8 was consistently minted at around 90% pure silver, weighing about 27.4 grams. Before this coin dominated, global trade was a nightmare of friction.
Because everyone had their own coins.
Right. If you were a merchant, every time someone handed you a handful of various local coins, you had to stop, weigh them on a scale, and assay them, meaning chemically test them, to make sure the local lord hadn't debased the currency by mixing in cheap lead or copper. It slowed trade to a crawl.
But when a Chinese silk merchant in Manila, a Dutch trader in Amsterdam, or an American colonist in Boston saw a Spanish piece of 8, they didn't need to weigh it. They didn't need to test it. They knew exactly what it was worth. It eliminated the friction.
It was universally accepted.
It was so universally trusted that the Spanish piece of 8 was legal tender here in the United States until the Coinage Act of 1857. You could literally walk into a market in New York before the Civil War and buy your groceries with a silver coin minted by indigenous laborers in Bolivia. That is the definition of a global currency.
But here is the most fascinating macroeconomic twist of the era. Spain was digging up all this silver in the Americas, and they were using it to buy things in Europe. But Europe wasn't the final resting place for the metal.
No, it just passed through.
Right. The ultimate destination, the giant vacuum cleaner sucking up the vast majority of the New World silver, was Asia, specifically China.
The Eastern engines. While Spain is tearing apart the Andes, there's a massive economic crisis forming in the East that demands silver to fix it. But before we get to China, we have to talk about the other major producer, Japan. Because Japan was a massive player in the silver trade long before the Spanish galleons arrived.
Absolutely. In the 16th century, while Potosi was booming, Japan was experiencing its own massive silver rush at the Iwami Ginzan mine. At its peak, Japan was producing roughly 30% of the world's silver.
And they use a completely different technology to extract it, right? No mercury.
Right. They didn't use the patio process. They used a technology imported from Korea called haifuki-ho, which is a method of cupellation. Chemically, it works like this. The miners take the silver ore and melt it down in a furnace, but they add large amounts of lead. The lead acts somewhat like the mercury in the Spanish process. It bonds with the silver.
But how do they separate the lead from the silver once they are bonded?
They take that silver-lead alloy and place it on a bed of bone ash, the cupel. Then they blast it with intense heat and oxygen. The lead oxidizes, turning into litharge, and is absorbed right into the porous bone ash, leaving a perfect pure bead of silver sitting on top.
That's brilliant.
Japan was using this high-quality silver specifically to trade with China, buying silk, porcelain, and medicines.
Okay, so Japan is pumping silver into China, and Spain is shipping galleons across the Pacific from Mexico to Manila, pumping New World silver into China. Why is China absorbing all the silver on Earth? To understand this, we have to look at one of the greatest, most disastrous macroeconomic experiments in history.
The Ming Dynasty's attempt at fiat currency.
Yes. Centuries before modern central banks, the Ming emperors issued paper money. It was called the Deming Tungsing Baochao, a brilliant idea in theory. Paper is light, easy to transport, and the state controls the supply.
The problem is, the Ming emperors didn't understand the underlying mechanics of inflation. They viewed paper money simply as a tool for state spending, not as a representation of underlying economic value.
They just saw it as free money.
Whenever the emperor needed to pay for a massive border war against the Mongols or fund a giant public works project like repairing the Grand Canal, he didn't raise taxes. He just ordered the treasury to print more paper money.
And mechanically, when you radically increase the supply of a currency without a corresponding increase in the goods and services available to buy, the value of that currency plummets. It takes more paper to buy the same bag of rice. And to make matters worse, the paper was relatively easy to counterfeit.
A deadly combination.
So you have the government printing massive oversupplies of official paper money and counterfeiters flooding the market with fake paper money.
It triggered catastrophic hyperinflation. The people completely lost faith in the paper. If a merchant sold a bolt of silk for paper money, by the time he walked to the market to buy food, the paper was worth half as much. By the 1420s, the paper money was effectively worthless.
The Ming government tried falling back on copper coins, but there simply wasn't enough copper in China to support an economy of that scale, and the regional mints couldn't produce coins consistently. Think about the gravity of this. You have an empire of over 150 million people. It is the largest, most technologically advanced, dynamic domestic economy on Earth. And they literally do not have a functional currency to trade with.
Merchants were reverting to barter. The state was unable to collect taxes efficiently because peasant farmers were trying to pay their taxes in grain or labor, which is incredibly difficult for a centralized bureaucracy to manage and transport.
You can't run an empire on traded chickens.
No, you can't. The Ming state was facing structural collapse. They needed a stable, universally accepted, highly valued unit of exchange. They desperately needed silver.
And this absolute existential desperation in China created what we can only describe as the arbitrage of the century. The global discrepancies in the value of silver were staggering. Let's walk through the actual mechanics of this trade, because this is where the global economy essentially becomes a money-printing machine for European merchants.
Arbitrage is when you buy an asset in a market where it is cheap and simultaneously sell it in a market where it is expensive. In Europe, the exchange rate between gold and silver was deeply established and relatively fixed at about 1 to 12.
Meaning, if I have 1 ounce of gold, I can trade it for 12 ounces of silver.
Correct. But in China, because their domestic economy was suffocating from a lack of reliable currency, silver was prized above almost anything else. In China, the ratio was 1 to 6.
Wait, so in Europe, it takes 12 ounces of silver to buy an ounce of gold. But in China, it only takes 6 ounces of silver to buy that exact same ounce of gold. Silver was literally twice as valuable in China as it was in Europe.
Precisely. So imagine you are a savvy merchant. You take a ship loaded with 12 ounces of Spanish silver. You endure the brutal voyage to Guangzhou or Manila. You take your 12 ounces of silver, which the Chinese merchants are desperate for, and you treat it for gold at the 1 to 6 ratio. You now have 2 ounces of gold.
Okay, I follow you.
You sail back to Europe where gold is highly valued. You trade your 2 ounces of gold at the 1 to 12 ratio, and you receive 24 ounces of silver.
You started with 12 ounces of silver and you ended with 24 ounces. You literally doubled your money just by moving metal from one side of the planet to the other without actually producing a single physical good. And that's just the raw metal trade. Most merchants used the silver to buy Chinese manufactured goods, silk, porcelain, tea, which sold at massive markups in Europe.
It was an irresistible economic magnet, but this raises a question that modern economists often debate. If a massive fleet of European ships is arriving every year, loading up millions of tons of incredibly valuable Chinese silk, highly crafted porcelain, and tea, and all they are leaving behind are chunks of silver rock.
Why wasn't the Chinese emperor freaking out?
Exactly. Weren't they worried about a massive trade deficit? They were exporting their real manufactured wealth and importing metal.
Right. If another country today was just printing money and buying up all our real assets, we'd call it an economic attack.
That is a very modern, mercantilist way of looking at it. But the Ming bureaucracy didn't view it as a loss of wealth or a trade deficit. They viewed the influx of silver as the acquisition of a vital public utility.
Because they needed the liquidity.
Yes. Their state was on the verge of collapse. They couldn't collect taxes, merchants couldn't trade. The silver entering China was monetizing their domestic economy. They were happily trading consumer goods for the financial infrastructure they desperately needed to survive. To the Ming, importing silver was like importing the very concept of a functioning economy.
They were buying financial stability. But as we know, when you mess with the money supply on a global scale, there are always unintended consequences. What happens when you dump 100,000 tons of new money into a closed global economy? Spoiler alert. It breaks things. Let's talk about Economics 101 and the fall of empires.
Let's start with Europe. The Spanish kings look at the endless convoys of galleons arriving in Seville from Potosi, unloading mountains of silver, and they naturally think, we are the richest, most powerful nation on earth.
So they do what kings do. They start spending money they don't have, assuming the mountain will pay for it. They fund massive, endless religious wars in the Netherlands. They build the incredibly expensive Spanish Armada to invade England. They import luxury goods from all over the world, but they didn't understand the macroeconomic forces they were unleashing on their own citizens.
They triggered an economic catastrophe known to historians as the Price Revolution. Between 1500 and 1650, the Spanish Empire essentially flooded Western Europe with silver. Now, basic supply and demand. When the supply of a commodity drastically increases, its value drops.
It's just not as rare anymore.
Because there was suddenly so much silver circulating in the economy, the actual purchasing power of the silver plummeted.
Meaning prices for basic goods shot up. Over that 150-year period, inflation across Western Europe spiked by 400%.
400%. And the tragedy of inflation is always who it hurts the most. The wealthy merchants and the bankers who had access to credit and owned hard assets got incredibly wealthy. But the working class got crushed.
Because wages didn't rise to match the inflation. If you were a Spanish peasant farming wheat or a cobbler making shoes, the price of the food you needed to survive quadrupled, but the amount of silver you were paid for your labor stayed exactly the same. The people actually doing the physical work in Spain were plunged into desperate poverty. Spain literally inflated itself into bankruptcy while sitting on the largest pile of money in human history.
It is a profound lesson in the difference between wealth and money. Spain had money, but because they destroyed their domestic manufacturing base and relied entirely on imported goods bought with silver, they destroyed their actual wealth.
But the macroeconomic impact in China was even more dramatic and far more violent. In 1581, the Ming dynasty bureaucracy realized they needed to streamline their chaotic tax system. A powerful minister named Zhang Zhusheng instituted a massive, sweeping policy shift called the Single Whip Reform.
The Single Whip Reform fundamentally altered the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Previously, the Ming tax system was a mess. A peasant farmer might pay a portion of his taxes in bags of grain, another portion in bolts of silk, and the rest through corvée, which is forced physical labor for the state, like repairing a local dam.
Zhang Zhusheng looks at this and says, "This is too complicated. It's too easy for local magistrates to steal grain or exploit the labor." So the Single Whip Reform simplifies everything. It mandates that from now on, all taxes owed to the imperial government must be paid in one single medium: silver.
On paper, it is a brilliant administrative reform. It cuts down on local corruption and gives the central government immense liquid revenue.
But I see the trap. If you mandate that every single peasant in China must pay their taxes in silver, you have just tied the fate of every rice farmer in a remote village to the extreme volatility of the global bullion markets.
Precisely. And for a few decades, it worked beautifully because the Manila galleons and the Japanese ships were pumping endless streams of silver into China, keeping the supply high and the value relatively stable. But then the Black Swan event arrives.
The 1630s. A perfect storm hits the global silver supply chain. First, the Spanish crown, realizing their economy is in shambles and trying to stop the hemorrhaging of silver to Asia, cracks down on the Manila galleon trade. They restrict the number of ships allowed to cross the Pacific. Suddenly, the flow of New World silver to China drops significantly.
And at the exact same time, geopolitical shifts occur in Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate consolidates power and institutes Sakoku, a strict policy of national isolation. They close their borders to foreigners and drastically cut off their massive silver exports to China.
The global silver supply to China doesn't just slow down, it hits a brick wall. The suction pump breaks.
And here is where the mechanics of the single whip reform trigger a collapse. Because the flow of new silver stopped, silver within China suddenly became incredibly scarce again. When something is scarce, its value skyrockets. It experiences extreme deflation.
Put yourself in the shoes of a poor Chinese farmer during this shock. You grow wheat, you harvest your crop, and you take it to the local village market to sell. The local market operates on copper coins, so you sell your wheat for a big pile of copper. Now, tax season arrives. The imperial tax collector shows up and demands your taxes in silver. You take your pile of copper and try to exchange it for silver.
But because silver is now so rare and valuable due to the supply shock, the exchange rate has exploded. It now takes massive, impossible amounts of copper to buy a single ounce of silver.
The farmer hasn't done anything wrong. He grew the same amount of wheat. But suddenly, the money he earned from it is worthless when trying to buy the silver he needs to pay the government. He can't afford his taxes.
So what happens? The farmers are ruined. They are forced to surrender their ancestral lands to wealthy landlords to pay their debts. Millions of peasants are dispossessed. They starve. Simultaneously, because the peasants can't pay their taxes, the Ming government is suddenly starved of revenue. They can't afford to pay the massive armies guarding the northern borders.
The soldiers stop getting paid. They lay down their weapons, or worse, they mutiny and join the starving peasants. Massive, violent rebellions sweep across the Chinese countryside. A rebel leader named Li Zicheng gathers an army of starving, dispossessed citizens and unpaid soldiers, marches on Beijing, and the last Ming emperor hangs himself from a tree in the imperial garden. This singular macroeconomic shock, the sudden drying up of a global silver supply chain controlled by foreign powers, directly caused the violent overthrow and total collapse of the Ming dynasty in 1644.
It is a staggering historical tragedy, and you have to ask, why didn't the kings of Spain or the emperors of China see this coming? Why did they blindly march their empires off an economic cliff?
Because the entire concept of macroeconomics simply didn't exist yet. We look back at them with the benefit of modern economic theory. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, the concept of inflation as a systemic force, the velocity of money, the profound dangers of pegging your entire domestic tax base to a foreign-controlled commodity supply chain, these ideas had not been theorized.
They literally had no framework for it.
None at all.
Yeah.
They genuinely did not understand that hard money, like silver, could cause hyperinflation if the supply suddenly exploded in Spain, or catastrophic deflation if the supply chain broke in China. They were flying completely blind, experimenting with the global economy in real time.
It's a sobering realization. But before we wrap up, we need to pivot and look at silver not just as a financial instrument, but as a physical element. Because silver isn't just a shiny rock we collectively hallucinated a value for. It has actual physical, chemical properties that made it prized long before Potosi and long after the world moved off the gold and silver standards.
Yes. Let's look beyond the coin. The medical, industrial, and sporting uses of silver. Let's start with medicine, because the historical anecdotes here are amazing. We have written accounts of Alexander the Great around 335 BC, marching his armies across Asia. He absolutely insisted that his soldiers store their drinking water in silver flasks. Now, Alexander didn't know what bacteria was. The germ theory of disease was thousands of years away.
Right, he had no microscopes.
But he observed a physical reality. Water stored in leather or clay got slimy and made his men violently ill. Water stored in silver stayed pure.
He was utilizing an antimicrobial property that we now understand chemically.
Now, it wasn't just ancient generals. Jump forward a couple of millennia to the American pioneers moving west in covered wagons across the plains. It was common practice to take a silver coin and drop it directly into a wooden barrel of milk or water. It prevented the milk from spoiling in the brutal summer heat.
They were observing a very real, very powerful chemical reaction. We now know the mechanism. When silver atoms are exposed to water or moisture, they undergo surface oxidation. This reaction releases bioactive silver ions into the liquid.
And what do the ions do?
These ions are essentially toxic to microbes. They attach to the cellular walls of bacteria, disrupting their internal processes and literally suffocating the bacteria and algae.
It's nature's built-in hand sanitizer. And once the medical field realized this, it led to some major life-saving milestones in the 1800s, long before the invention of modern antibiotics.
One of the most famous examples was in 1852. A pioneering, though historically highly controversial surgeon named Dr. J. Marion Sims started using very fine silver wires for surgical sutures instead of the traditional silk or gut threads. He discovered that the silver wires dramatically reduced post-operative inflammation and prevented infections that were usually fatal at the time.
And then, in the 1880s, an obstetrician named Carl Creed introduced a practice that saved the eyesight of countless infants. He started putting drops of a silver nitrate solution directly into the eyes of newborn babies moments after birth.
The mechanism there was vital. If a mother had an undiagnosed bacterial infection, like gonorrhea, the bacteria could be transferred to the baby's eyes during birth, causing severe neonatal blindness. The silver nitrate instantly killed the bacteria. It was so remarkably effective that using silver nitrate drops became mandatory by law in hospitals across the United States.
But, of course, as with anything in chemistry, the dose makes the poison. There is a bizarre side effect to ingesting or being exposed to too much silver over a long period of time. And it leads to my absolute favorite piece of historical trivia, the origin of the term blue bloods.
We've all heard that term used to describe the European aristocracy or nobility, but it actually stems from a very real, documented dermatological condition called argyria.
Because the European nobility were so unfathomably wealthy, partly thanks to the massive influx of silver from Potosi, they surrounded themselves with the metal. They ate all their meals off solid silver plates, drank their wine from silver goblets, and used silver utensils. Over a lifetime of doing this, microscopic trace amounts of silver particles would scrape off into their food. They were essentially eating silver for decades.
The human body cannot easily process and excrete silver, so the silver particles accumulated in their skin tissues.
And silver, as we know from photography, is photosensitive. When these aristocrats went out into the sunlight, the silver particles embedded in their skin reacted to the light, literally turning their skin a faint, permanent, ghostly shade of blue.
It looks unbelievable.
It sounds like a myth, but argyria is real. And the wild part is, for the nobility, having a bluish tint to your skin was actually the ultimate flex. It proved two things. One, you didn't have to work outside in the sun like a common peasant. And two, you were rich enough to eat every single meal off pure silver. You were a literal blue blood.
It's a fascinating quirk of history. But silver's physical properties make it arguably more important to our daily lives today than it was during the Spanish Empire.
Oh, absolutely. Forget the coins. Silver has the highest electrical conductivity and the highest thermal conductivity of any element on the periodic table. Nothing moves electricity or heat better than silver.
Which means it is the hidden backbone of our modern technological world.
Think about it. When you go to the hospital and take an X-ray, traditional X-ray film relies entirely on silver halide crystals to capture the image. If you have a solar panel on the roof of your house, the photovoltaic cells are laced with silver paste to conduct the electricity efficiently. The smartphone in your pocket, the computer servers processing the digital economy, they all require highly conductive silver components. Even space exploration relies on it. If you are an astronaut on the International Space Station, the water purification systems you rely on to survive are heavily silver-based. We are still using Alexander the Great's water purification trick in low Earth orbit.
And despite all this modern industrial utility, we still retain that ancient, deep-seated psychological connection to silver as a marker of elite human achievement, particularly in sports.
Right. If you win the men's singles tournament at Wimbledon, they hand you a massive silver cup. The women's champion gets the Venus Rosewater dish, an enormous silver tray. The NHL Stanley Cup, arguably the most famous trophy in sports, is constructed of roughly 35 pounds of solid silver. And here is a great piece of trivia to impress your friends at the pub. Olympic gold medals. They haven't been made of solid gold since the 1912 Stockholm Games.
It would be far too expensive today.
Exactly. The International Olympic Committee mandates that a modern gold medal must actually be composed of at least 92.5% solid silver, which is then just covered in a very thin plating, about 6 grams of gold. Even when we call it gold, the foundation of human victory is still made of silver.
So if we take a moment to synthesize this incredible, bloody, world-spanning journey we've been on today, what do we find? We see that silver is the ultimate paradox of human history.
How so? Connect the dots for us.
It is a remarkable, healing, antimicrobial agent that purifies our water and saves infants from blindness, yet the industrial extraction of it poisoned tens of thousands of indigenous miners with mercury neurotoxins and silica dust. It was the vital financial foundation of the first truly global trade network, brilliantly connecting the markets of Europe, the Americas, and Asia for the first time. Yet the sheer volume of it caused massive hyperinflation that bankrupted the very Spanish Empire that mined it, and the sudden scarcity of it triggered deflationary spirals that violently collapsed the Ming Dynasty.
It's just a constant contradiction.
Exactly. It remains a symbol of elite status, held high by athletic champions and eaten off by blue-blooded aristocrats, yet the vast majority of it was dug from the freezing, pitch-black earth by some of the most brutally exploited and oppressed people in human history. It is the metal that built the modern world, both its greatest triumphs and its darkest horrors.
That is an incredibly profound way to look at it. And it leaves us with something really important to chew on as we wrap up this deep dive. Let's look back at the Ming Dynasty one more time. In the 1600s, an incredibly powerful, technologically advanced empire of 150 million people collapsed into fire, starvation, and rebellion. Why? Because of the single whip reform, they tied their entire domestic tax system and economic survival to a single physical asset, silver, that they fundamentally could not domestically control. When the global supply chain fractured due to decisions made by Spanish kings and Japanese shoguns halfway across the world, the Ming were destroyed.
It is the ultimate historical warning about the terrifying fragility of complex, interdependent global systems.
Exactly. So think about the world we live in today. As nations race to digitize their currencies, as we tie our entire global economy and logistical survival to decentralized digital blockchains, to massive energy-hungry server farms, and to rare earth minerals mined halfway across the world just to build the microchips we need to communicate, are we blindly setting ourselves up for a modern-day single whip reform collapse?
We assume our digital networks are permanent, just as the Ming assumed the silver ships would always arrive.
Right. If our digital supply chains suddenly fracture, or a massive cyber attack drops the grid, or a geopolitical rival cuts off the export of rare earth metals, do we have the domestic resilience to survive it? Or are we just the Ming Dynasty, sitting in our palaces, waiting for the silver ships that are never going to arrive? History rarely repeats itself exactly, but as the saying goes, it certainly rhymes. Usually when we talk about a financial system, there's this expectation of clinical precision, like looking at a clean black and white X-ray. But as we've seen today, diving into the mechanisms and the human cost, the true X-ray of the global economy isn't clean at all. It is a messy, bloody, deeply human picture, shaded in silver and built on a foundation of both miraculous innovation and unimaginable sacrifice. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you next time.